Welcome everybody to the latest SPF UK Climate Resilience Programme webinar. Today is the second webinar on the recent IPCC Working Group 2 report, which focuses on impacts, vulnerability and adaptation. Can we have the next slide, please? So today we have three great speakers. Firstly, we'll have Leah talking around chapter 16, so focusing on key risks across sectors and regions, giving a perspective of a lead author. Then we'll have Diana Rekeen. She'll be focusing on chapter 7, where she's a convening lead author, and picking up the issues around decision-making options for managing risk, something that's really key to, I think, the stakeholders of this programme who'll be online. We'll then follow that with a response. The response is coming from Richard Miller, who's Head of Adaptation and Climate Science at the Climate Change Committee. He'll give a policy perspective on what the results mean. And then we'll follow that with the usual Q&A session and a discussion with the full panel. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So, rules of engagement. I think many of you have been to a lot of these webinars now. The series has been running for much of the COVID period. But for those who are new, we'll have the presentations first and then the discussion. At any time, you can post questions in the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of the screen. I suggest everyone monitors what's going into the Q&A box and you upvote your favorites. Often we get some quite similar questions, and upvoting really helps us try and prioritize those questions of most interest. Attendees will be muted. Occasionally it's relevant for us to try to bring you in, but it's somewhat difficult to do that when we have a big audience as we've got today. The audio and the slides will be shared after the event, so we're obviously recording today. And if you have technical problems, then please use the chat facility. You can also live tweet if you've got something you want to say about this event, and do please look at our website as well, because we're constantly updating with new content. We do have some program news first, so if we can have the next slide. There are a couple of new papers coming out from the program. So this one is from the Impress and Open Clim projects, and it's a new paper looking at UK heat stress, driving the calculations with UK climate projections, UK CP18. I was reading this paper a couple of days ago, actually. I think it gives a really interesting perspective on future change. Next slide, please. The other big piece of news is that the eFlag project has now got its projections of flows in the UK online. The data's available for people to use, and the team at CEH and HR Wallingford and BGS have done a great job pulling together not only the flow data, but information also on drought indicators. And there are some links in the slide here of how you can actually download the data. CEH also has a news story on their web around this website around this item. Next slide, please. Another exciting event coming up is that we're planning a festival to enable a wider range of people to access the programme. So this is not just a series of talks, this is a series of activities. The aim is to be fun as well as informative. There'll be lots of hands-on events during the festival. We're going to have this in Hull. Why Hull? Because many of the projects have used Hull as a case study region. And we thought, because there is so much going on that's really place-based in Hull, it would be a great venue for the festival. So if you want to put that in your diary, that's for the 12th and 13th of September. Looking further ahead, we're also at the early stages of planning a conference in March 2023. This will be in London, and this will take both a science and a policy perspective. Next slide, please. So with that, let's go into the first talk, and I'm going to hand over to Leah to give the first part of this. Leah, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jason. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So hopefully you can see that. Maybe just give me a shout, Jason, to let me know if that's working okay. Perfect.
That's perfect. I can see that very clearly.
So I wanted to start with this main overarching quote from our recent report that the science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And really, our report is an attempt to offer solutions and guidance for how to make decisions moving forward. So I was a lead author on chapter 16, and this was one of the synthesis chapters. And what we did is we synthesized evidence of risks and observed observations. So that's whether adaptations are taking place now. And then I'll pass over after that to Diana, who can talk in a lot more detail about the process of adaptation and the potential for adaptation options and solutions. And what I decided to do today is do a presentation via 10 figures. So I selected some of our major figures from chapter 16, and some of them are borrowed from the SPM because they're a bit clearer. And I just want to share with you some of the messages that I think are the most interesting in some of our visuals and some of our figures. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. So firstly, I want to talk about the evidence, really, and how it is that climate impacts different ecosystems and different societies. So the evidence of diverse impacts and attribution has increased since AR5. And so the details of this figure are less important than just a representation of all the different parts of our world in which climate matters. And that's from the cryosphere and land to the atmosphere, marine and coastal ecosystems, within our water system, food system, terrestrial system, as well as impacts through social pathways. And some of the colors here can hint at where we're seeing increasing evidence of attribution. So those that are in gray are where we're increasingly seeing changes that we can attribute to human-caused climate change. And in yellow, these are impacts that we're able to attribute to long-term changes in climate. And then those that are in blue are those mechanisms that we know are climate sensitive. We don't always have ways in which to attribute it to human-induced climate change, but we have pretty good theoretical understanding that climate could have important impacts on those. And so the evidence is really growing and mounting even more so now in AR6. Secondly, I wanted to highlight some of the key global risks that could become severe with combinations of high warming, high exposure, vulnerability, and low adaptation. So these are sort of the clusters of risks identified by the hundreds of scientists involved in the IPCC reviewing the literature. These are the areas that we think have the potential to become the most severe based on this combination of these three pieces which make severe risk. One is warming, how much the climate is warming. A second is how vulnerable societies are to climate changes. And the third is our ability to adapt. And we have impacts on all three of them. And so these key risks range from impacts and risks to ecosystems, such as loss of particular habitats in the terrestrial and marine and coastal environments, to human health, impacts via heat, vector-borne disease, and waterborne disease, as well as impacts on societal systems through changes in armed conflict and migration, or what is referred to here as involuntary mobility. And these were identified as sort of the major areas that we want to keep a close eye on and that we have reasons to be concerned about. Oh, I think I just went backwards. There we go. The severe risks can occur through different combinations of climate warming, vulnerability, exposure, and adaptation. And so this can be a bit of a confusing figure, but I just wanted to highlight a few things here to explain the ways in which severe risks can emerge. So for example, in Arctic regions, continued high levels of warming, that's the Red Sea, and continued persistent high levels of vulnerability and exposure, that's by that little red circle with the EV in it, combined with low levels of adaptation, that's that red A, can really result in severe risks to Arctic livelihoods. And that's because many Arctic livelihoods and cultures are highly, and economic economies are highly dependent on hunting and fishing environments. Another example, if we look at livelihoods in sub-Saharan Africa, because a huge percentage of, or a large percentage of the population is employed in climate-sensitive agriculture, if there is persistent high vulnerability exposure and low adaptation, if we're not doing a lot to help people adapt, even at low levels of warming, we can see severe risk emerge. So this means even with low levels of warming and decarbonization, if vulnerability remains high and adaptation remains low, we can begin to see severe risks emerge. We see something similar for livelihoods in South Asia, where there's also high dependence on climate-sensitive agriculture. And in this case, with high exposure and vulnerability, even with low levels of warming and high levels of adaptation, we can see severe risks to South Asian livelihoods. So there are some of these different risks can become severe with different combinations of action on decarbonization, vulnerability, and adaptation. Excuse me. So the areas where severe risks could occur, even with low and medium warming, some of the sort of those that we highlighted as the most sensitive in this sense, include water scarcity and water-related disasters, poverty and involuntary mobility or migration, and insular ecosystems and biodiversity hotspots. So these are areas that can really progress to severe risk, even with high levels of decarbonization globally. I want to talk a little bit further about how severe risks can occur under different scenarios. This is actually quite a complicated figure, so I've just taken out one small piece focusing on low-lying coastal systems. And what I wanted to share with you today is really how there are different combinations, different trajectories based on the actions that we take that could result in severe risk. So in this case, for low-lying ecosystems, specifically risks to coastal production and habitat, loss of lives, livelihoods, and well-being, and disruption of transport systems associated with low-lying coastal areas. We could get severe risk either through high warming and high vulnerability alone, or even if we have low warming, and even if we have some adaptation, high vulnerability alone could actually drive a severe risk. Or if we have high vulnerability and no adaptation, even with low warming, we could get severe risk. So depending on the combination of how much we're decarbonizing, combined with how much we're adapting, how much we're addressing the underlying determinants of vulnerability within human populations, there are different ways that we can both reduce our risks or see our risks increasing. So I wanted to flag those different trajectories. Working group 2 is really about understanding not only how the climate system affects our risks, but how these other pieces, vulnerability and adaptation, and our actions in those realms affect our risk. One thing that's important to note, and is much more difficult to analyze and predict, is how risks can cascade across regions and sectors. So really understanding the impacts that a particular hazard and risk in one region can have globally is really important and may be a substantial part of the impacts we see. And just this example that's shown here is how climate-related flooding in Thailand in 2011 had downstream implications for economies and trade. The example here is some manufacturing and prices in North America, in Japan, and in Europe. And I think we're seeing a lot of the same sorts of cascading effects I think we've experienced with COVID, that we've experienced with the current war in the Ukraine. There's cascading effects that even though something's occurring in one region, it can really create compound and cascading issues globally. And that's something that's much, much harder to evidence and to predict, but is really quite important and will be important. So these are what we call our famous or infamous burning embers. And what I wanted to flag here, the message I really wanted to convey, is that even small differences in warming matter. And so these burning embers are basically moving for a particular risk. So RFC is reasons for concern. So these are sort of our major areas that we think we should be watching out for. So if we look at unique and threatened ecosystems or unique and threatened systems, we can see moving from relatively low risk levels in yellow to high risk levels in purple. As we move up in levels of warming, that's the y-axis, happens pretty quickly. So we don't spend a long time in yellow and red. We quite rapidly, even with tiny changes in warming on that y-axis, we quite rapidly get into the purple, the high risk. So even tiny differences in warming can bump us up into that purple or that very high risk zone across most of our major risks, unless we're doing something else to delay or compensate for that by reducing risk via adaptation or reducing vulnerability. Just to give you an idea of where we are now, we're starting to be able to estimate where we think these transitions and risks are occurring. So for that first one, risk to unique and threatened ecosystems, we believe we're currently at the level of high risk, so red, and we expect that we'll transition into very high risk around 1.2 or 2 degrees. That's soon. So we're quite close to that. This is sort of the text or a table version of the last slide. And actually this is, sorry, the fire alarm's going off in the background is being tested. So this is something I created. So it's actually not a formal, it's not a formal figure. For risk associated with distribution of impacts, global aggregate impacts, and large scale singular events, we think we're in the moderate or the sort of the high yellow zone, but we think that we're going to be transitioning into high risk between 1.5 degrees and 2 or 2.5. And again, that's not far away. So you can see from these numbers and from the last slide that our transitions into high and very high risk do not require high levels of warming. And in many cases are occurring between that critical 1.5 to 2 degree zone. So we're really approaching really important transitions for risk. This slide is a specific example taken from the heat, taken from the SPM based on the heat chapter to show you how those burning embers change if we consider adaptation. And the idea here is really adaptation or early adaptation can delay or reduce high levels of risk. So we can delay those transitions, we can spread them out, we can, in a sense, we're creating a bigger yellow zone. So we can stay at these lower to moderate levels of risk before we get into severe risk if we're having high levels of implementation of adaptation. And to further that idea that adaptation can delay and reduce severe climate risk, adaptations can also generate co-benefits. So this is a figure extracted from the SPM, the Summary for Policymakers, flagging for all of these different adaptations on the left-hand side, all of the different places, and you can see lots of positive, lots of plus signs there, all of the potential benefits for different sustainable development goals. So in some cases, not all, but in a large number of cases, climate adaptation responses are a good idea and can have benefits even regardless of their climate risk benefits. So we're talking about the potential for a lot of win-win options. There's also potential for maladaptation, and I think that Diana will talk in a little more detail about potential maladaptation and adaptation benefits. So are we actually adapting, or what evidence do we have that we're adapting? The good news is that there is now emerging evidence that we can document that adaptation is taking place. However, despite this progress, most adaptation remains fragmented and focused on planning. So we're very much in the early stages of adaptation. A lot of the adaptation that we can tell from the evidence seems to be ad hoc, emerging, still planning focused. This figure just gives a summary globally of evidence on adaptation and the extent to which it's transformative. And the key idea here is to see there's a lot of light blue, which means low, which means we're not yet really penetrating into these darker blue colors, which suggests high levels of evidence of transformative or substantial adaptation. So from what we can tell from the evidence, there's really still a significant substantial adaptation gap. And with that, I'd like to pass over directly to Diana to give us some more detail from chapter 17. I will end share. There you go. And put on mute so you don't hear my fire alarm.
Good. So then let me see whether I can get this up. What are you seeing? You are seeing not the right.
We're seeing the slides, but it's in edit mode at the moment.
Okay.
Not presenter mode.
Okay. And actually the other thing is I wanted to have it on this screen so that I am actually looking into the camera.
Now we can see your email.
Oh gosh. See my email.
Now it's gone back to PowerPoint, but it is the edit mode rather than the presentation mode.
Okay. Let's see my email. That is okay. Let's try that again. So do you see at least the slides now?
We can see the slides, but we can also see down the left-hand side what slides are coming and your menu at the top. Now we're getting there. Now we can see the speaker mode, I think. So we've got the big slide on the left. We've got your next slide on the right. So it's nearly there.
I think
we've got it. That's it. Perfect.
Yes. Okay, so sorry for the delay, and thanks, Leah, for the nice overview of chapter 16. And yes, there is also kind of a handover in the whole report that chapter 16 looked at observed adaptation, and we move on in chapter 17 on documenting what kind of adaptation options are there, and what do we know about the processes that can be enabled, adaptation processes, and more of the social aspects that go along with an adaptation process. So here I did it similar to Leah, that I'm focusing on the most important figures of chapter 17. This is the introductory figure, and we really here see that we are actually using that decision cycle, which is rather known to many policymakers, I assume, so that you do vulnerability and risk assessments, then the identification of options, planning and implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and review. But we actually address it in a little bit more interactive session, which is seen here by that these dark blue bullets, and these are referring to sections of chapter 17. So here 17.2 is actually spread across assess climate risk and contextual factors, and then we go on here in the responses. So we really talk in chapter 17 about options, processes, and enabling conditions for climate risk management. We look at success factors and the risk of maladaptation. So can we say something to either side of that spectrum? What do we know about monitoring and evaluation and the integration of risk management across sectors, jurisdictions, and time horizons? So to step right into adaptation options, so what do we see can be done? What kind of options are the most prominent and maybe the most promising per sector? There, first of all, the high-level message is that adaptation options have been proposed, planned, or implemented across all sectors and regions with prospect for wide-ranging benefits to nearly all people and ecosystems. And that is very much in line with what Leah mentioned and with the assessment that chapter 16 has done. What we did in chapter 17 is that we actually asked the regional and sectoral chapters what their most important adaptation options are. And these are then here plotted in this table against, let's say, the scale of benefits or breadth of applicability, as we call it here at the top. Whether this is very specific, can potentially benefit below 1 billion people, whether it can benefit 1 to 5 billion people or above 5 billion people. And then this is shown across benefits for ecosystems and ecosystem services. What you see, for instance, nature restoration and diets and food waste are most important and can really benefit a large number of people. And then you have other options like infrastructure retrofitting, building codes, disaster early warning, governance cooperation, spatial planning, availability of health infrastructure, and access to healthcare that are potentially beneficial to many people, but there are also some trade-offs or harms attached the further you get down in the table. And some of it I will explain and highlight later on. So then about enabling conditions, and that is an important aspect of AR6 in chapter 17 that we for the first time really looked at aspects that are helping to foster adaptation, helping to set adaptation in motion. Because in particular, one of our co-chairs said right in the beginning, we have had enough, so to say, information on what is changing and which kind of impacts we are seeing, we also need to give decision makers information on what they can do about it. And that's why there was a strong call for enabling conditions and solutions, so that actually what can be done is highlighted as an equal part in this report. And in chapter 17, we concentrated on governance, finance, and information and knowledge. And these were also mandates. You probably know that brief outline of a chapter is given to each chapter team in the beginning of the cycle. And these topics per chapter are decided and agreed by the government delegations as well. Enabling condition governance. We see governance is the most important aspect when it comes to enablers, in particular when it is inclusive and context sensitive. Formal and informal approaches are seen often in conjunction and in polycentric arrangements of public, private, and community actors. And here that figure has an icon for community governance, here for private governance, this closed lock, and for public governance, that's the open lock. So you see, in particular, larger and darker blue colored open locks. So here put in yellow, that is the public governance. And you really see that these are public governance is important for most adaptation options, also with a broad, with a high potential for transformational adaptation and high confidence. Again, here, one of, or each of these tiles, so to say, are one of the adaptation options that chapter 17 has identified. Then we get to the red part, and this is private sector governance. This is important for insurance and diversification of livelihoods, but rather, but less important for other adaptation options. And communities and individuals are actually important or have been identified as important actor for resilient infrastructure. Very surprising, actually. Supporting migration, that is more clear. And poverty reduction, also I think a surprising aspect, that for these, not public governance, but rather community and individual governance is seen as the most important actor in the literature. Okay, then one more aspect about governance: national and international legal and policy frameworks and instruments support adaptation, but especially when they are combined with guidelines for action. So when the national or international level says how the lower level governance levels can actually act upon the frameworks that are given at the higher level. There is a steady increase in national and subnational laws, policies, and regulations. And we also see that lower levels of government now are to some respect influencing the governments higher up. Yeah? So that there is kind of a push or request from cities mostly, or large local areas onto the national government level to do something. Then about finance. That is of course an important but at times also contentious issue, but we assess the evidence in the literature. Yeah, so it is just what we find. in the scientific publications. And we see that since era 5, the gap between estimated costs of adaptation and the documented tracked adaptation finance has widened. Estimates vary strongly due to differences in assumptions, methods, and data. And that is also what you see in the figure, that here different papers estimated the costs of adaptation based on different scenarios. The absolute estimated adaptation costs are higher for developed countries, but they are much higher for developing countries when it comes to the percentage of GDP. And this calls for the crucial role of international finance, because self-financing is increasingly, or is highly difficult for developing countries. You may also remember that there was the agreement in Copenhagen in 2009 to spend $100 billion per year from 2020 onwards on climate finance. We see that that is not being met. This is for mitigation and adaptation. And we also see that that number is probably, even though it was not even met, very underestimated. At the time in 2009, it was just, let's say, a relatively arbitrary number. And we see that only the estimated costs of adaptation for developing countries are a multitude higher, also depending on the time and scenarios, of course, but they are much higher. We here see also how the current spending for climate, for how the current climate finance is spent. For instance, here that 89% come from public sources and only about 2% from private sources. Most of the money comes in forms of grants, concessional grants, non-concessional and equity grants. We see that the largest share goes to the water, wastewater and waste management sector, closely followed and more equally spread than by agriculture, forestry, natural resources, disaster risk management and cross-sectoral sector. And the largest finance in terms of regions, the largest chunk goes to transregional positions, with the second largest being sub-Saharan Africa. Okay. And information and knowledge, we see that climate services are used, but that the utility would be strengthened if it's developed in a co-creation process. There are still significant gaps in the evaluation of climate services, and we actually do see that they do not reach the most vulnerable and more isolated people, so more work is needed there. And what we also see is that so-called catalyzing conditions or windows of opportunity stimulate more rapid uptake of adaptation. These disasters or shocks, can be used. There is also more climate litigation, but we also see decision innovators like climate leaders and mayors and city governments acting. And this is expected to continue in the future, in particular litigation, in particular when the attribution, climate impact attribution science matures further. But those catalyzing events have an important characteristic, and this is that they transport a sense of urgency. Oops, sorry, I don't know where that happened. Whereas in the lower part, when urgency is perceived to be low, there is not really action or not sufficient action when you are in the middle part, so let's say a medium sense of urgency, then it can really catalyze action. But when you're in a high sense of urgency, then also this does not help for decision making and adaptation, because yeah, then you feel helpless. But the solution or the decision making aspect here is that when there is a low sense of urgency or a high sense of urgency, where good designed communication strategies should actually bring the urgency level to this medium range. And we see, for instance, that these events like COVID-19 or the war in the Ukraine are drawing resources and pose opportunities at the same time. A bit worrisome is that with higher degrees of warming, these disasters increase. So we might be just jumping from tending to one disaster after the next. So just managing one disaster after the other. And this draws resources and limits action for long-term change, so that we're really setting onto a path that is sustainable and resilient. We also make a strong call for deliberate processes where stakeholders jointly consider change and uncertainties. This is called robust decision making, and can lead to no regrets, so the identification of no regrets, and also identify trade-offs, so reduce the risk of maladaptation. With that, I am coming to the chapter 17, insights on successful adaptation versus maladaptation. And we here have seen that very recent literature actually puts them onto a continuum, where maladaptation is one end of the continuum and successful adaptation is the other end. And that there is no real, let's say, there are no real stages, but that it's really a continuum that you move from one to the next. And adaptation options are floating around according to time, or also according to how they are implemented, where they would end up, and then it's decided where they would end up on the continuum. We have assessed thereby suggested an operational framework for maladaptation versus successful adaptation by looking at trade-offs and benefits and co-benefits. As already Leah said, there's a strong focus in this report on benefits and co-benefits of adaptation. And we looked at benefits to humans, benefits to ecosystem services, equity outcomes, transformational potential, and reducing or contribution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is then also plotted here. That is a rather busy figure, but it's actually the same information. We have those criteria that are used for the assessment of each adaptation option at the top, so in columns, and then here in rows, sorry, I don't know where that happens all the time. And then in rows, the adaptation options that chapter 17 uses, and then we assess how many benefits there are, or how large the risk for trade-offs with these groups and sectors is. And then we summarize that into this slider at the right-hand side, where you see, for instance, that here coastal infrastructure has a high risk for maladaptation, whereas, for instance, nature restoration, which is light blue, or diets and food waste, changes in diets and food waste have a very high potential to end up as a successful adaptation. Yeah? This is based on observed information, but is then formulated into the potential of the the potential or the risk of ending up as maladaptation or as signifying successful adaptation. And with that also, just my last slide, we highlight that monitoring and evaluation is key because we need to track adaptation progress and we need to learn about whether we are actually doing the right thing, whether adaptation is successful or would be need to classify as maladaptation after some years and some time. At the moment, we see that most M&E is in its early stages. About 1/3 of countries have a national adaptation M&E and 1/6 of those are reporting on implementation. But as Leah already pointed out as well, a lot of adaptation activity is happening on planning at the moment, and really implementation is much less, and even M&E of implemented actions is even less. And the final then outcome, or the final aspect I would like to highlight, is that we see that all those options and also processes and instruments that we are highlight in the chapter, which I have not really concentrated on in this presentation because it's a lot of tables in our chapter, but that all this needs to be seen in an iterative and interdependent integrated manner, because often we have compound impacts like those that are happening in common, or we have cascading impacts, those that are in an impact chain. And decision makers are in the position to respond to various risks that are there for their jurisdiction. So that's why systematically integrating adaptation across risks and jurisdictional scales is extremely important. More needs to be done there. And that needs to account for the dynamic nature of risk over time. So also looking at the future and what kind of impact scenarios are there for the regions. With that, thank you very much. And I would then hand over, I think, to the next speaker. I stop sharing.
Okay, we have Richard Miller up next to give a response.
Yes.
Thank you, and thanks both for the presentations. So I've just been asked to give a few quick thoughts on this report in a UK context. So for those who don't know, we're the Climate Change Committee. So we're the independent statutory advisor to the UK government on both emissions reduction and adapting to a changing climate. So to kick it off, I guess my first thoughts really is that, they're just the sort of breadth and depth of the evidence base that we now really have on adaptation and the impacts of climate change, both here in the UK and globally. And I think the evidence base that's been assembled and really nicely summarized in this IPCC report really chimes very well with the evidence base that's been looked at for the UK aspects of climate risk, which were most recently summarized in the third climate change risk assessment for the UK, or CCRA, which was published last summer. And there's a really, I think, a nice synergy of framings between that report looking at the UK and this IPCC report looking globally, both in terms of like the use of kind of global warming levels as a sort of key marker really of, I guess, the climate change we're seeing, and translating that into what it means for humans and for ecosystems. And also this sort of sense that there is this amount of inevitable change that's going to happen over decades through to around 2040, 2050 that we know we're going to have to prepare for and adapt to regardless, even if the world's as successful as we might hope in rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions from today's levels toward zero. And then we also need to be planning for this spectrum of possibilities that we might see beyond that really will depend on how successful the world is in reducing emissions. I'd say just on the content of the report, the thing that struck me the most actually is the impacts on nature and ecosystems. And as Leah was showing, that sort of reason for concern bar there, I think it's really quite compelling actually. I think the latest understanding we now have on on what the impacts on nature will be, even at the levels of warming we're at today, let alone where we're going in future. So something I think is really relevant for the UK too, where we see lots of the most high priority risk areas for the UK are things connected to the natural environments that we need to be thinking about how we do what we can do to help adapt for those. And turning on to adaptation, I think the really nice thing in the report is it does couple the picture of where we might go to with these risks and the quite significant impacts that might happen with the potential for adaptation, if done effectively, done well, and implemented at scale, can help to paint a more positive picture of where we might go to. So I think that's really nice to see, and a really important message that we do have some agency over managing these risks, as well as reducing our global emissions to try and limit the amount of climate change we see. So just 3 really quick areas where I think that's particularly critical for the UK. So firstly, the sort of centrality of the power system and this nature of the cascading risks that were talked about in the presentations. Here in the UK, we know that the power system is going to maybe double in size as we get from where we are today through to net zero, electricity being used much more in transport, in our heating. So it's really increasing the potential exposure of our society here in the UK to failures of the power system, connected with extreme weather events, connected with changes in wind patterns, wind droughts, for instance. So something we really need to be planning for at the outset as we build that system. And then the second area I want to talk about is the international picture. So I think in the UK, as was the nice example of the sort of the impacts arising from the floods in Thailand, cascading across the world, that we also need to be aware that we're plugged into this ever increasingly connected global system. So understanding what we can do to help manage those risks around the world and reduce their impacts on the UK through supply chain management, et cetera, is really important. I think this report is a really nice summary of what we do know about risks that are happening around the world and thinking about how that impacts on the UK. So maybe just to wrap up with, what does it mean? So I think 3 things for what it means. I think it means overall. So one is just, we just do have this most detailed evidence base we've ever had really on climate impacts and adaptation. It's really, painting the case for why we need to get on with trying to manage these risks right now. And to do that, we need this sort of cross-government, cross-society response. And I think it's really striking through the report, just the number of areas of society that will be touched by aspects of climate risk. And it really needs this sort of mainstreaming across all of policy activity, but also beyond policy into businesses if we're going to manage these challenges accurately. And then my final point really, I think, is that value of the thing that I think Diana almost closed with there, the sort of value of monitoring and evaluation. I think the UK is one of the places that has a relatively sophisticated monitoring and evaluation system at the moment, but we know there's a lot more that we need to do. I think we need to really get serious about really understanding what we're doing with adaptation, tracking its effectiveness so we can correct course, make sure we're taking the actions that really are having demonstrable impacts on reducing climate impacts, vulnerability and exposure on the ground. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to Leah and Diana as well. What excellent talks. I've been to several Working Group 2 talks now, and I learned something new at every one. But I really like the focus on risk. I think it's brought out some of the aspects of Working Group 2 that are really relevant to the solutions agenda. We've got several questions in. We're not going to get through all of them, but let's see how many we can get through in the live session, and we'll try and answer any remaining via the website afterwards. So the first one is from Jack Bedford. He's asking, how can we enable action on adaptation before catalyzing conditions occur? Is there a way to increase people's sense of urgency to act? Who wants to take that first? Perhaps Diana, then Leah on that one.
Okay, yes, great. So I think there are 3 points. Of course, if I would know it by heart, then, and we would have that in the literature, I think then it would be easy. It's not easy, but I see personally 3 things that might help. And this is indeed the litigation aspect that is coming up. Yeah, because we have now also seen in Europe that litigation is used more. We know it from the Netherlands, and we had a very important case in Germany too. The second thing is that I really believe in the youth movement. We have also included that in our chapter, and maybe it has not brought as much change as the youth has hoped, but I think it has really done a lot. Much more than the IPCC was able to do over the last almost 30 years. I mean, the first IPCC report was published in 1992. So it's a long way since then. And the third aspect, I think, is really with regard to the private sector. It is just not clear to the private sector yet what kind of potential there is, what kind of business case there is in both mitigation and adaptation, and it would be really worthwhile to making that known to them and get the private sector on board for change. That would be the three most important things I see.
Brilliant. And Leah, do you want to come in on that one?
Sure. I'll just add not much. Everything Diana said, I agree with. The one thing I would add is I think that shifting the narrative away from climate change responses and adaptation being a sacrifice and a trade-off that will cost sort of other parts of our lives, economically or otherwise, but actually to a benefit. So if we are strategically focusing on these win-win options, then the things that we would do to benefit climate adaptation would benefit other parts of our lives, either economically or things that are good for our health. So I think if we really focus on the potential benefits of climate adaptation, regardless of climate, what are the decisions that we're making now? What are the things that we're doing? And how can we make those decisions in ways that are good for multiple goals, of which climate is one? I think taking that narrative and that approach could be quite helpful moving forward.
Brilliant. So the next question I'm going to pick is: vulnerability and disempowerment are inextricably linked. What should be done to ensure empowerment, especially at the local community level and particularly in developing countries? Leah, do you want to take that one first?
There's that dangerous word "should," which is above our pay grade, in a sense, in the IPCC, in terms of what we're trying to do. We're trying to advise global organizations and governments on what could be done and what the implications might be. So moving into the realm of shoulds is something we're quite careful about not doing, because it's clearly something outside of our mandate. What I would say is that it's very difficult, and there's many ways to do that. I mean, empowerment is not something you simply do. We create empowerment and it happens. It's really a process that has to occur over a long period of time, and through sort of sharing of power and negotiation and discussions. I think the IPCC itself is working on and struggling with those challenges just internally on how it is we can integrate Indigenous and local knowledge into the evidence base that we assess. And I think in some ways that's the way the IPCC is trying to create a little bit more empowerment in terms of our process. I think, though, I would shy away from more directly answering your should question, but maybe Diana will be bolder than me.
Diana,
Yes.
briefly.
Yeah, thanks. But I'm on the same page with Leah. It is such a difficult topic also. And years of research has shown that both is not easy, huh? Like full participation, but also poverty reduction. These are broad terms, and there is no simple solution. So I can't really give a more concrete answer on that. It's just, that I think we would be good for also other benefits than just climate to keep on trying in that respect.
Great. We're running out of time, but I'm going to squeeze in one last question, and I'm going to address this one to Richard, I think, maybe from a UK perspective. What's needed to encourage more adaptation at the community and individual level, in your perspective, Richard?
Yeah, I think it's what'll be really useful here is a bit of a clearer mapping of, you know, who is the right levers to address these different adaptation challenges. So adaptation is so broad, there's so many different actions, different scales of action that are needed. And I think something we're thinking about a lot at the moment is trying to build out a bit of a clearer narrative and a clearer sense of what are the actions that are required and what's the level what that's expected to be done at. And I think when doing that, you can sort of identify which bits are most critical for individuals, which are most critical for businesses. I think just one example of that, I think it's just a lot of it is just a greater level of information and understanding on things like how you might even manage your house when it gets really hot. You know, should you be opening the curtains, closing the curtains, opening the windows, shutting the windows at different times and conditions? So even things like that, I think, can go a good way to just, you know, helping understand the smaller actions people can take to help reduce some of their own climate risks.
Brilliant. There are loads more questions, but we've reached our 1 o'clock time. So we'll try and pick up on more of those via the website, because there are some really insightful questions. Our next event is coming, I think it's the 23rd of March, when we'll be looking at a UK framework for climate services. So once again, thank you to all of the speakers. Absolutely excellent talks and reflection on the talks. And thank you to the audience for such good questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.